When the world goes quiet, some voices still remain. Not every soul finds peace when the clock strikes 12. There are stories hidden in the shadows, whispers drifting between the living and the forgotten. Some stories linger, some souls don't leave. Welcome to Stillness After Midnight, where every silence tells a story. If you're drawn to the mysteries that stir after dark, the voices that echo when the world sleeps, subscribe now and join us as we listen to the souls who still have something to say, because in the stillness, the truth finally speaks. Do you know what it feels like to walk into a classroom where every seat is filled, except the one that matters most? Every night at exactly 3:17 a.m., I find myself back there. The walls smell faintly of chalk dust and old paper. The clock ticks, but its hands spin backward, dragging me into a time I can't escape. 30 pairs of eyes are fixed on me, not warm, not alive, just watching. And yet one chair remains empty. It's always his chair. They say a single moment can change everything, but no one tells you how small that moment can be. Just a mark on a piece of paper, a grade, one number out of 100, and a life quietly slipping away. I used to believe I was a good teacher, fair, firm, objective. But the night the desk went empty, I learned that fair can be cruel and objective can be blind. I didn't notice the signs, or maybe I did, and I chose not to look too closely. After all, there were lesson plans to finish, meetings to attend, deadlines to meet. Isn't that how it always starts? You tell yourself you're just too busy until you realize you were too busy to save someone. His name was Mark. He wasn't the kind of student people remembered. Quiet, awkward, the sort who sits at the edge of group photos. He had a way of folding into himself, like he was afraid to take up space. I thought he was just shy. I thought wrong. Now, I teach in a place where the air never moves, where the blackboard writes its own words when I'm not looking. Sometimes it writes questions I can't answer. Why didn't you listen? Did you see me? Was I invisible to you? At first, I told myself it was just guilt, some kind of waking nightmare. But guilt doesn't turn the classroom door into a hallway that never ends. Guilt doesn't make your reflection in the window move when you're standing still. I know what this is. I know where I am. I'm not in hell, I'm in something worse. This place is made of every second I didn't care enough, every conversation I cut short, every plea I ignored. I walk through it again and again, teaching students who don't breathe, don't blink, don't exist, except to remind me that I failed. People think the worst kind of punishment is fire or chains. They're wrong. The worst punishment is knowing exactly what you could have done and being given eternity to replay the moment you didn't. So I keep talking. I keep teaching. Maybe one day he'll come back and sit in that empty chair. Maybe one day I'll hear his voice again, not in whispers or written notes, but in forgiveness. But until then, the bell never rings, and the lesson never ends. The night arrives like a lesson I've already failed. At 3:17 a.m., the classroom remembers me. I don't remember choosing to return, only the sensation of the door handle cooling beneath my palm, the hush that follows, the rows of desks like rib bones in a fossil of a building that refuses to die. There's a quality to the darkness here, patient, attentive, like a student who has already memorized the answer and is only waiting to see if the teacher will get it right. I step inside. The lights don't turn on, but the chalkboard glows faintly with a film of dust, as if someone has just erased something important and what's left are the fingerprints of meaning. I know where I am. My head knows, my lungs know, my hands know. My mouth still pretends. Good morning, I say, and the word morning sounds like a cracked plate sliding into place on a table where no one is hungry. They are always here before me, 30 students seated in an arrangement no schedule ever printed. Their faces are both familiar and wrong, like photographs left too long in the rain. No one blinks. That would imply time is moving. Time here feels like a lock without a keyhole. They watch me with the courage of stillness, and I do what I was trained to do. I take attendance. Emily? A breath of air where a yes should be. Thomas? The chairs make a quiet sound, not a creak, not a scrape, more like a page turning itself. I speak their names to prove I still can. Only names like loose threads you can tug without unraveling anything that matters. There is one desk I never call, the empty one. It sits near the window where winter refuses to leave the glass, even in July. I keep expecting an outline to appear there. Backpack slouched, elbows guarding a world I never asked about. But expectation is the cruelest discipline I've ever practiced. It gives you extra homework when you're already failing. I tell myself this is about instruction, that there is a reason I am trapped in the profession after the profession is gone. So I reach for the chalk. Lesson 1, I write, and the chalk doesn't resist. It sighs. On the board, in my usual steady hand, the word becomes a verdict. Attention. I face them and hear my own voice as if it has been graded and returned. Decent structure. Poor heart. Attention, I say, isn't the same as looking. A boy in the back, he is no one, and he is everyone, tilts his head. I keep going because momentum, I've learned, is the counterfeit of courage. Attention is the act of allowing someone else's pain to rearrange your own priorities. A letter of chalk breaks under my thumb. The snap is loud enough to count as thunder in this windowless weather. I swallow the rest of the sentence. When I turn back, the board has added to itself without my permission. Under attention, and there is a smaller script, one I know by the tremor it puts in my bones. You missed it. I clean the board with the heel of my hand until the dust mists the air like breath on a cold morning. The message fades but does not leave. That is the rule here. Nothing that matters ever leaves. It merely settles. Open your books, I say, and 30 spines bend in unison. Their pages are blank. That should frighten me more than it does. Blankness is honest. It doesn't pretend to have answers. I move down the aisle, the quiet crunch beneath my shoes, some archaeological layer of former days. On each desk sits a single sheet of paper. No heading, no name. Just a grade in the corner. Not a letter. A number. Each number is the same. 62. The ink looks wet. I don't remember grading them, but the body keeps records the mind tries to burn. When I touch the corner of one page, the number drips like time. At the window near the empty desk, the glass reflects a person I have the credentials to be. Suit jacket, tie slightly wrong, a face someone once might have called patient. The reflection raises a hand when I don't, then drops it, embarrassed on my behalf. The hallway beyond the door doubles in the reflection, extending past possibility. If I step into that hall, I will walk a corridor of lockers that never yield a combination, past posters for dances that never happen, past a drinking fountain with a confession caught in its pipe. I've walked that hall before. It goes on until it becomes a thought. And when you arrive at a thought, you are forced to think it. I stay. My feet root in the knowledge that the room is the epicenter of whatever quake my soul owes. The ceiling hums, the clock does its useless ballet. On my desk, where once the day's objectives would have been, lies a folder of evaluations, my handwriting in the margins, my neat rubric of fairness. I open to a random page and find a line I wish were written by someone else. Ethan maintains appropriate distance with students to preserve objectivity. I used to be proud of that sentence. Now it feels like a wall with a trophy mounted on it. A cough, I look up. The empty desk has a shadow where a body would block the light if there were light to block. The shape is not convincing. It's what a child might draw if asked to sketch an absence. Still my mouth says, Mark? The name arrives like a stone thrown into a well you can never stop listening to. Echo after echo, it takes a long time to hit. When I first taught, I had a ritual. I would begin each semester with a speech about effort. I would say, I don't grade who you are, I grade what you put on paper. It sounded noble until I met someone whose paper was a battlefield only visible if you looked past the ink. The trouble with principles is not that they are wrong, it's that they are right too loudly. I approach the empty desk as if it can bruise. The desktop is cold, with a persistence I can't explain. Beneath it, perhaps out of habit more than hope, I look for the scuffed sneakers that never found their place under my expectations. Nothing. Only the strangest certainty that if I pulled the chair back, it would make the sound of a tide retreating from stones. On the seat rests a folded note that was not there a moment ago. I've rehearsed refusing it. I pick it up anyway. The paper is softer than it should be, worn down by fingers that clearly needed something to hold. Inside, there are only 3 words, each letter careful, considerate, like a child picking up glass. Was I visible? The question doesn't end with a question mark. It ends with a smudge, as if the hand that wrote it learned too late that punctuation is an afterthought when the answer is already known. I turn the note over as if truth has 2 sides and I've been reading the wrong one. On the back, 317. It's not ink, it's graphite, erasable in theory. I place the note back on the desk, but the desk refuses it. The paper slides to the floor like a bird that has forgotten how to land. I pick it up again, because repetition is its own confession. We're starting with attendance, I hear myself say, to no one I can save. But today, we'll call not names, but moments. I write them on the board. The raised hand I didn't see. The laugh I mistook for coping. The silence I graded as effort. The chalk nicks my knuckle, a white crescent of penance. Behind me a student, her hair like the memory of summer, breathes the smallest word into the air. We. It slips between desks and finds me. Because I thought fairness was a shield, I answer, hating the accuracy. Because I believed being fair meant being the same to everyone. I forgot that sameness is a kind of blindness. The clock clicks backward, another minute. 3:16. The room tilts almost imperceptibly, a ship that knows it's already found its iceberg. I steady myself on my desk and notice the top drawer is open. Inside are the things a teacher hoards. Old worksheets, extra pencils, a stapler with a grudge. Beneath them, a test. The questions come back to me like roads I once took without noticing the scenery. Essay prompts meant to measure thinking. Multiple choice meant to measure guessing. In the corner, in my neat red pen, there it is. 62. I read the answers I didn't read when they still had a chance to become something else. On the final essay, a sentence that hesitates and then dares. Sometimes I think people are windows. Some are painted shut. My comment beneath it is an algorithm of good intention. Vague, clarify. I didn't ask what he meant. I asked him to be efficient with his pain. I set the test down. The room watches without judgment, which is worse. I try to imagine the other numbers I could have written there. I try to imagine what it would have cost me. 5 minutes after class, a question asked gently, a name said like it matters, a rumor I could have challenged, a chair I could have pulled closer. I try to imagine and fail because imagination isn't time travel. It's only the map you sketch after you're already lost. The door opens, not the sound, the fact. And in the frame stands a figure I recognize the way you recognize handwriting, by the pressure it puts on your breath. He is thinner than memory, taller than regret. His face is what distance does to a person. He does not look at me. He looks at the empty desk and then past it to the board where attention still bleeds through the erasure. I say his name again, but this time not like an invocation, like an apology that has learned how to stop being about the apologizer. Mark, I whisper. He does not answer. Instead, he walks to the far wall where the posters for reading week curl like leaves. He touches one with 2 fingers. The paper flutters as if remembering wind. I'm about to ask the question that has been breaking me open night after night. Can you hear me? When I notice the chalk in his hand. He didn't pick it up. He has it the way rain has wetness. He writes on the far corner of the board, small so that I must stand too close to read it. I do. I have no pride left about distance. Start over, he writes. The instruction is a mercy I don't deserve. How, I ask, desperate, ridiculous? With what? I am a man who built his life on assessment, asking for an answer, key to the soul. He places the chalk down, carefully, like a fragile thing you can only borrow. Then he turns, and for the first time his eyes meet mine. They are not angry, which would have granted me the dignity of conflict. They are not forgiving, which would have let me go. They are exact. I understand then that forgiveness is not a door you walk through. It is a room you learn to clean. Start with one person, I say to myself, because saying it gives the words a body. Start with the child in front of you. I turn to the class, to the 30 faces that are the architecture of my sentence. We'll begin again, I tell them. Today's objective is not content, it's contact. The far fluorescent hums in slow agreement. On each desk, the 62 evaporates, leaving a pale watermark of what could have stayed if I had insisted. The blank pages are still blank, but they feel less like accusation and more like invitation. I release the breath that I've been grading for years. The clock hesitates at 3:15 and then, impossibly, chooses not to move. I understand what this means. Time will wait to see if I mean what I say. I move to the empty desk. I pull the chair out and set the note on the wood as if returning a borrowed sky. Was I visible? I read again, and this time I answer, not with a speech, with a seat. I sit in the empty desk. The metal frame complains softly. The complaint feels earned. From this angle, the board is farther, the room larger, the face is taller. Authority shrinks. Attention grows. The window is closer, and I can see the world I failed to introduce to a boy who thought he was not invited. Roll call, I say, but I do not say the names printed on rosters. I say what I should have asked the day I wrote a number with the confidence of ignorance. Tell me one thing, I begin, that made today hard. The students do not move. Their mouths remain loyal to silence. But the air changes as if the room has agreed to reconsider me. That is all I have ever needed from anyone I hurt. Reconsideration. A sound gathers in the hallway. Not footsteps, the leak of memory when it finally finds the crack. I know the hall will be waiting when I get there, that it will carry me past the locker with a photograph taped inside. Mark half smiling at a world that never taught him how to ask for warmth. I know it will deliver me to the counselor's door, where a box of tissues stands like a lighthouse no ship can truly see. I know I will pass the water fountain that gurgles questions too late, the bulletin board with scholarships that require eyes able to meet their promises. I know. But knowing has never been the same as doing. I stand from the empty desk and leave the chair pulled out, a shape preserved for the next invitation. I gather the blank pages from the other desks and stack them like a future. When I place them on my own desk, a weight lifts, tiny but real, the way a cloud lifts when it decides not to become thunder. Homework, I say, smiling at the cruelty of the word and then forgiving it. Find someone tomorrow and ask them how they are. When they answer, believe them the first time. The class does not nod, but their stillness is less hard. The chalk no longer writes on its own. It waits for my hand, and I allow it to be heavy. I write exit ticket on the board, then pause, then cross it out and write entrance instead. I am not trying to be clever. I am trying to be new. The door remains open, a patient rectangle. I step toward it and stop. There is one thing left to do before I let the hall test my sincerity. I go back to the empty desk, touch the note, and speak plainly to the room, to the bimai, to the version of myself that mistook distance for dignity. I see you, I say. I see you now. The confession does not fix the past. It builds a table in the present. The room listens. It always has. The clock, having waited long enough to be sure I meant it, risks another second. 3:16 becomes 3:17, and I am returned to the beginning, which is the only honest ending. I walk into the hall, and this time it does not stretch into impossibility. It narrows into purpose. Somewhere beyond the lockers, a bell does not ring. It breathes. I used to think silence was just the absence of sound, that it was neutral, safe, the kind of quiet you could trust to leave you alone. Mark taught me it isn't. Silence is a language, one I never bothered to learn. It's strange how memory behaves in this place. It doesn't arrive like a reel of film, smooth and complete. It comes in pieces, as if someone has taken scissors to the timeline and left me to reassemble it in the dark. The first piece is always the same. Mark, standing by the door on his first day, clutching a backpack too new for the rest of him. The straps were tightened all the way, pulling the bag so close to his body it was as if he feared someone might take it from him. Or perhaps it was the other way around. Maybe the bag was holding him together. "New student," the principal had said, ushering him into my class. "Mark Ellison." He didn't look at me when she said his name. His eyes lingered on the floor, scanning it like he was searching for an exit map written in the cracks. I smiled the way teachers are trained to smile. Warm but not too warm. Professional but not cold. "Welcome, Mark. Take any open seat." My voice was too even. I thought that was kindness. He took the desk by the window, the same desk that would one day be empty forever. I should have known then that windows are for people looking for somewhere else to be. Days passed before I heard his voice for the first time. It wasn't in response to a question. It wasn't during a group activity. It happened in the quiet after class, when most of the students had left. I was at my desk, grading a quiz, red pen in hand. I felt a presence beside me. Not intrusive, just there, like the shadow of a leaf moving in the wind. When I looked up, he was standing there, eyes still fixed downward. "Mr. Ethan?" It was almost a whisper, but not quite. More like the echo of a whisper. "Yes, Mark," I said, keeping my tone patient, the way I thought a good teacher should. He hesitated, and I thought I saw him glance at the paper I was marking. His lips moved again, but whatever words came out were too soft to survive the air between us. "Sorry, say that again?" He shook his head. "It's nothing." And before I could stop him, he was out the door, swallowed by the tide of bodies in the hallway. I told myself it probably wasn't important. Children think a lot of small things or big things. That's what I thought then. Now I know the reverse is true. Most big things hide inside moments small enough to ignore. There were other times, little fragments, like the morning he came in late, eyes red, and muttered something as he passed my desk. I caught only a single word: hard. I assumed he meant the math homework. I made a note to review the material. That's the kind of teacher I was, someone who thought every problem was academic. Once, during a group activity, I noticed him sitting with his head down while the others worked. I walked over, asked if he was okay. He whispered something I didn't catch. I asked again, but he just shook his head and said, "I'm fine." The universal lie, and I let it stand. In this place, I hear his whispers differently. They don't fade, they follow. Sometimes I hear them in the empty hallway, brushing past my ear like someone leaning in too close. Sometimes they don't sound like words at all. Sometimes they sound like the inhale you take before deciding whether to speak or stay silent forever. I want to believe he was trying to tell me something, and that if I had only leaned closer, if I had given him my full attention instead of the fraction left over after grades and meetings and deadlines, I would have understood. But the truth is crueler. I think he knew I wouldn't hear him. I think he whispered because it was safer to go unheard than to risk what might happen if someone actually listened. Here, in this version of the classroom, he whispers still. Not every night, but often enough that I've stopped expecting quiet. I'll be writing something on the board, words I think are mine, when suddenly I'll feel it, warm and close to my ear. I tried. I never turn around fast enough to catch him. By the time I look, the empty desk is empty again, and the window is fogged as though someone breathed against it. Once, I wiped the glass clean, and 3 words were written there in a shaky finger. You looked away. I wish I could argue. I wish I could say I didn't. But the mind keeps perfect records, whether we want it to or not. I remember the way I'd glance at him only long enough to confirm he was physically present. I remember telling myself not to hover, not to single him out, as though invisibility were a form of kindness. People ask, silently, because in this place there are no visitors, what I would say to him if I could. It's a question with too many answers. I would say, I'm sorry. I would say, I didn't understand. I would say I thought I was protecting him by keeping my distance. I would say I see now that I was protecting myself. But there's something else I would say, something I never said when it could have mattered. You don't have to whisper. You hear the cruelest part? Here in this ghost of a school, his voice is louder than it ever was in life, not because the volume has changed, but because I can finally hear it. Every syllable cuts clean through the static of my old priorities. And yet, every time I reach out toward that voice, it moves just beyond my grasp. Like he's walking down the hall ahead of me, turning the corner just before I arrive. I keep chasing. I have to. Because somewhere inside those whispers is the answer to the only question that matters now. Was there ever a moment I could have changed his mind? And if there was, did he give it to me softly, hoping I would lean in and take it? Grades are supposed to be a measurement, a number, a letter, a neat objective symbol that says, here is what you did, here is where you stand. That's the lie they teach you in teacher training, that grades are a mirror. They're not. They're a knife. And sometimes, without meaning to, you hand it to a student by the blade. I still remember the day I graded Mark's paper. Not because of the number I wrote, but because of the way my hand didn't hesitate. I didn't pause to ask why half the essay questions were blank. I didn't think about the fact that his handwriting, usually so careful, was jagged, uneven. I just flipped through, tallying points, red ink moving like a pulse I didn't want to listen to. 62. That's what he earned, according to the rules. I circled the number, drew a clean line under it, the way you'd sign the end of a contract. I thought I was being fair, consistent, professional. The paper was still warm from his hands when he turned it in. I didn't think about that until much later, how he had written it that very morning, probably in a rush, maybe in the hallway, maybe sitting in the cafeteria with the noise pressing in around him. I didn't think about how every answer might have been written in a room that didn't feel safe. The next morning, I handed back the graded tests. I placed his on the corner of his desk without making eye contact. Not because I was cold, at least that's what I told myself, but because I didn't want to embarrass him. He looked down at it. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the faint scratch of chairs shifting, the whisper of paper sliding across wood. When his eyes landed on the number, something in his shoulders collapsed. Not dramatically, just a small inward fold, like paper being creased for the first step in an origami you can't yet recognize. I moved on to the next desk. That's what you do. You keep the class moving. You don't linger. You don't stop to examine the way a single number can pull gravity into a person's body. I've replayed that moment 1,000 times in this place. Sometimes I imagine setting the paper down and saying, this doesn't define you. Sometimes I imagine sitting beside him, asking if everything was okay, if there was something going on at home, if he wanted to talk after class. Sometimes I imagine him telling me the truth, that he was tired, so tired, and that the weight of everything was getting too heavy. But that's all it is now, imagining. In reality, I didn't say anything. I just gave him the grade and moved on. In this place, the number 62 follows me. It's written in chalk on the board no matter how many times I erase it. It's carved into the desks, etched into the hallway lockers, reflected in the glass of the classroom windows. Once, I saw it spelled out in pencil shavings scattered across my desk. I swept them away, but when I looked again, the shavings were arranged the same way. And sometimes I find the number not as ink or chalk, but as a feeling, a measurement of failure, not his but mine. I used to think grades were neutral. They were just data, and data couldn't hurt anyone. But I see now that a grade is never neutral when the student behind it is already breaking. For some kids, it's a message. Keep going. For others, it's the last confirmation they need that no one sees them. I think for Mark, It was the latter. That week, I noticed he stopped raising his hand in class. He stopped meeting my eyes, even in the casual moments when students pass in the hall. I told myself maybe he was just tired. Maybe it was nothing. I've learned the hard way that maybe it's nothing is the most dangerous sentence a teacher can believe. Here, the memory always plays differently. Sometimes I see myself holding the paper, but unable to set it down, as if my body knows something my mind refuses to process. Sometimes I see Mark take it from me, but instead of looking down, he looks up, straight into my eyes. And in that gaze, I see everything I missed: fear, exhaustion, and something like surrender. In those versions, I still move on to the next desk. No matter how I try to rewrite the scene, I always make the same choice. And that's what keeps me here. A few nights ago, if you can call time nights in this place, the paper appeared on my desk again. Same number, same red ink, same clean circle around it. But this time, something was different. There was writing under the last question, words I had never seen before. They were faint, as if written in pencil and then partially erased. I didn't finish because I couldn't think. My head was too loud. The words blurred before I could read them twice. The paper dissolved into the air, leaving only the echo of graphite between my fingers. If you've never taught, it's easy to imagine that you always have control, that you can keep emotion out of it, that your judgments are clean, that your fairness protects you from guilt. But the truth is, every grade is a conversation. Sometimes it's the last conversation you'll ever have with that student. You just don't realize it at the time. I didn't realize it. And now the number 62 has become a language I'll never stop hearing. The day started the way all unremarkable days start, without warning that it would end differently. The sky was a dull paper gray, the kind of morning where the sun seemed to have decided that light wasn't worth the effort. I remember sipping coffee at my desk, the room filling slowly with the sound of shuffling feet, the hum of idle conversation. Mark wasn't there. I noticed, but I didn't notice. It wasn't unusual for him to be late. Sometimes he drifted in a few minutes after the bell, sliding into his seat as if trying to fold himself into the noise that had already settled. I told myself he'd arrive soon. I told myself a lot of things that morning. 10 minutes into class, the door opened. Not for Mark, but for Mrs. Chandler, the school counselor. She never interrupted class unless something was wrong. Her eyes were red, not the kind of red you get from staying up too late, the kind that comes from wiping them too often. She stood in the doorway for a moment, her hand on the frame, as if steadying herself before stepping into the room. "Ethan," she said, her voice soft but too steady, like it had been rehearsed. "Could I speak to you outside for a moment?" The students shifted in their seats, sensing something off. I stepped into the hall, pulling the door gently behind me. The hallway was empty, the fluorescent lights above us buzzing like insects that refused to die. She didn't ease into it. She didn't dress it in soft phrases or lead me down a trail of hints. "Mark Ellison passed away last night." For a second, the words didn't fit in my ears, like she'd spoken in a language I didn't understand. Passed away was something you said about grandparents, about old neighbors, about people who had already had their turn. Not about a boy whose backpack straps still squeaked when he adjusted them. I must have said, "What?" Not because I hadn't heard her, but because the alternative was silence, and silence would have meant I'd accepted it. She told me there would be an announcement over the intercom soon. She said the principal wanted to speak to the students, to offer counseling. Her words were careful, balanced, each one placed like a stone across a rushing river. But no matter how carefully she placed them, there was no path across. I asked the only question my mind could form: how? She hesitated. "It's not my place to—" She stopped herself, glanced at the classroom door behind me. "Ethan, it wasn't an accident." Something inside me tightened, a knot pulled too hard. My mouth went dry, my thoughts narrowing to a single point that hurt to touch. She said she'd need me to keep the class calm after the announcement, to watch for students who might need support. Her voice was clinical now, moving into protocol. I nodded because that's what was expected. But inside, something had already split open. When I walked back into the room, the students looked at me like they already knew. Not the details, but the shadow of it. Kids can feel the air change before anyone tells them why. I don't remember what I said. I think I tried to continue the lesson, my words sliding off the walls like water that wouldn't stick. My hands shook when I wrote on the board. A few minutes later, the principal's voice came over the intercom. He said the words tragic loss and beloved member of our school, and please reach out if you need someone to talk to. His voice wavered on the last part, like the sentence had been heavier than he expected. When he said Mark's name, the room froze. Emily, who sat 2 rows over from him, covered her mouth with her hand. Thomas stared at the empty desk as if expecting it to disappear. I didn't look at the desk. I couldn't. After the announcement, there was a choice. We could send the students to the library, where the counselors had gathered, or we could keep them in class. Most chose the library. A few stayed. The ones who stayed sat in a strange stillness, like they weren't sure if speaking would make it more real. One of them, a boy named Caleb, asked if he could move seats. His voice was quiet, almost apologetic. He didn't say why, but I knew. He'd been sitting right next to Mark. The rest of the day blurred. Meetings, emails, whispered conversations in the faculty lounge. No one said the word, not the real word. We wrapped it in cotton. Incident, situation, passing. We talked about support plans and resources. We avoided the truth like it was a doorway we weren't ready to open. But in my head, the truth was already standing in the doorway, looking at me with Mark's eyes. That night, when I returned to this place, the place where time is always 3:17 a.m., there was something new on the empty desk. Not a note, not the graded paper. This time, it was a folded corner of lined notebook paper, the kind torn hastily from the back of a spiral bound. I unfolded it. In the center, in faint pencil, were 3 words. You gave it. I didn't have to ask what it was. I already knew. The next time Mrs. Chandler's voice comes to me in this place, it's different. It echoes down the endless hallway, not from the real day, but from some stitched-together dream version of it. Ethan, she calls. We lost him. Her voice overlaps itself, saying the same sentence again and again until it's no longer a statement but a rhythm, like footsteps pacing outside a locked door. And every time I hear it, I wonder the same thing. Did I lose him because I wasn't holding on? Or because I never reached out in the first place? It began with something so small I almost missed it. A slip of paper, folded twice, sitting on my desk when I arrived in this version of the classroom. It wasn't there when I left. At least, I think it wasn't. But in this place, cause and effect don't always shake hands. The paper was white, not aged or yellowed like most of the things in here. Clean, crisp. It looked like it had been torn from the center of a notebook, avoiding the edges where wear and time leave fingerprints. I unfolded it slowly, half expecting it to dissolve into dust before I could read it. Inside, written in small, neat handwriting, were just 2 words. You missed. No punctuation, no name, just that. I stared at it for a long moment, waiting for the rest to appear. Another sentence, a clue, a context. But the words didn't change. They didn't need to. At first, I told myself it could mean anything. You missed the meeting, the lesson, the point, the signs. But deep down, I knew exactly what it meant. And I knew exactly who it was from. Mark. I placed the note back on my desk and stepped back, as though distance could dilute its meaning. The class was silent, the students sitting perfectly still. Their faces were hazy in that way they sometimes are here, like a photograph that's been handled too many times. The only clear thing in the room was the empty desk. I didn't touch the note again during that lesson. But I kept glancing at it, like it might suddenly grow heavier and slide off the desk on its own. Each time I looked, the words seemed darker, as if the ink was still sinking into the paper. When the bell rang, if you can call the sound here a bell, it was flat, almost reluctant. The students stood in unison, moving toward the door without looking at me. They filed out silently, leaving me alone with the note. I picked it up again. It was warm. That's when the scratching started. It came from the chalkboard. A slow, deliberate sound, like chalk being dragged just hard enough to resist the surface. I turned and saw words forming in the center of the board, the chalk moving without a hand to guide it. You missed it. This time with the "it" spelled out in full. I walked toward the board, my breath slowing, my heart doing the opposite. The handwriting was Mark's. I knew because it was smaller than most, cramped like he was always trying not to take up too much space. When I reached out to touch the letters, the chalk dust clung to my fingertips, cold and damp. I wiped my hand on my pants, but the dust didn't smear. It stayed, like it had chosen me. The next night it happened again. Only this time the note wasn't on my desk when I arrived. It was tucked under the leg of the empty chair, folded into a triangle the way kids sometimes do when passing secret messages in class. Unfolded, it read, "You didn't see." The pattern became clear over the next few nights. One note each time, always short, always written in that same careful hand, sometimes on paper, sometimes scrawled faintly on the window, other times appearing on the blackboard while my back was turned. And the messages were all variations of the same accusation. You didn't look. You didn't hear. You weren't there. I started keeping the notes. In this place, objects don't always behave. They can vanish without warning, dissolve into air, or reappear in places you swear you already checked. But I hid them in my desk, pressing them flat between the pages of the attendance book. They never disappeared from there. It was as if even this place understood that a record must be kept. On the fourth night, the note was different. Not just words this time. There was a drawing, a crude outline of a desk, the kind you'd find in any classroom. But drawn inside the outline was a single circle. A coin, maybe, or an eye. Below it, in smaller handwriting than before, "You never asked." That one stayed with me. Not just because of what it said, but because of what it didn't. It didn't say what I should have asked. It didn't say when. It just sat there, daring me to fill in the blanks. And of course I could. There were so many moments after the quiz, after the group work, after class, that I could have stopped him, pulled him aside, asked the questions that matter more than grades. But I didn't. The notes began to feel less like messages and more like a curriculum, a syllabus of failures, each one a lesson I was supposed to learn, but too late. I found myself waiting for them, needing them, as if somewhere in this ritual was the possibility of rewriting what had already been written. But no matter how many I collected, the empty desk never filled. One night I came in to find the chalkboard completely covered, not with words, but with the faint outline of hundreds of overlapping hands, some small, some large, some clear, some smudged. I recognized one, Mark's. I'd seen it once during an art project, his palm print next to his name in the corner of a poster the class made together. And in the center of the board, written in the smallest letters yet, almost invisible against the chalk dust, "Listen." I don't know what he wants me to hear. Maybe it's not words. Maybe it's the silence I used to think was harmless. Maybe it's the sound of someone deciding they have nothing left to say. They called it a parent conference, as though the phrase could contain what it really was. A collision between guilt and grief, staged under the sterile light of the counselor's office. I remember the way Mrs. Chandler avoided meeting my eyes that morning. She just gestured toward the open door. "She's here," she said softly, as if volume itself could break something fragile inside. I stepped into the room and there she was, Mark's mother. Her name was Anana, but I'd only ever used Mrs. Ellison in the short, polite emails about homework and attendance. Now, without the barrier of formality, I saw her differently. She was smaller than I expected, her shoulders drawn in like she was bracing against a wind that no one else could feel. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white. She didn't stand. I didn't either. "Thank you for coming," I began, and immediately hated how hollow it sounded, as if she'd had a choice. Her eyes flicked up to mine. They weren't red, not anymore, but there was a kind of dullness there, the look of someone who had already cried past the point of exhaustion. She nodded once but didn't speak. I sat down opposite her. There was a stack of tissues on the table between us, perfectly centered. They felt less like an offering and more like a silent reminder. You will need these. I I want to say how deeply sorry I am, I started. The words felt clumsy in my mouth, like stones I couldn't set down properly. Mark was, her voice cut through mine. You don't have to tell me what he was. I froze. She wasn't angry, not in the way I expected. Her tone was calm, but there was weight behind it, like she was carrying something sharp wrapped in velvet. I know my son, she continued. I know what he struggled with, and I know he didn't talk to people easily. She paused, her gaze drifting to the corner of the table as if the next sentence might be hiding there. But he liked your class. The words hit harder than I thought they would. Not because they were praise, they weren't, but because of what they implied. He liked my class and still, I swallowed, feeling the air in the room tighten. Then I failed him worse than I thought. Her eyes returned to mine, steady now. You're not the only one who missed it. The kindness in that sentence was colder than blame. If she had shouted, accused, demanded to know why I didn't do more, it would have given me something to fight against, some external enemy to direct my shame toward. But this was absolution shaped like a blade. In this place, the 3:17 a.m. version of that day, the conversation always shifts. Sometimes she asked me questions she never did in life. What did his voice sound like when he spoke to you? Did he ever look like he wanted to say more? Was there a day you thought about asking him if he was okay and decided against it? And no matter how many times she asks, my answers never change. Back in the real memory, she eventually sighed, a small, tired sound. Mark never liked to make a fuss. Even when something was wrong, he'd convince himself it wasn't worth bringing up. That's who he was. I wanted to say, that's who I was too. But the words stuck. Because unlike him, I had been given authority, a role that demanded I see beyond what was convenient, and I hadn't. There was a long silence between us. In that silence, I could almost hear Mark's whispers from the classroom, half words, cut off sentences, the beginnings of confessions I never invited him to finish. You're probably wondering if there was something you could have done, she said at last. Yes, I admitted. Every day. Her hands unclasped. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper, sliding it across the table toward me. This was in his backpack. I don't know if it was meant for you. I unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was Mark's, small and deliberate. It wasn't a letter. Just a list. Try harder on math test. Don't forget lunch. Ask Mr. Ethan. The sentence ended there. The ellipsis stretched across the page like a bridge he never finished building. I stared at it until the lines blurred. You can keep it, she said, standing. Mrs. Ellison, I began, but she stopped me with a small shake of her head. I'm not here to blame you, she said. I'm here because I need you to remember him as a person, not just a student who's gone. And then she left, the click of the door louder than it should have been. When I returned to this place that night, the note was already on Mark's desk. Not the one from her hand, the original, still folded, still warm. The list was the same, the unfinished line the same. Only one difference, the ellipsis was gone. In its place, in faint graphite, were the words, if you can hear me. It started the night after I met with his mother. Or maybe it started long before that, and I just hadn't noticed the wall shifting yet. When I walked into the 3:17 a.m. classroom that night, the air felt different. Not heavier, not colder, just stretched, like the room itself had been pulled too thin, as though someone had taken hold of its corners and kept tugging. The students were there, still frozen in their silent attention, still blurring at the edges if I looked at them too long. The empty desk remained by the window, as it always did. But the window wasn't showing the usual faint reflection of the hallway outside. Instead, it showed the hallway inside. At first, I thought it was just some trick of the glass. But when I turned toward the door, the view matched the reflection perfectly. Longer than it should be, lined with lockers that seemed to repeat themselves like a glitch in an old film reel. I stepped toward it. The door opened easily, no creak, no resistance. The hallway smelled faintly of pencil shavings and wet paper, like the aftermath of a storm that only rained indoors. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, too bright to feel safe. I took a step forward, then another. The door to the classroom stayed open behind me, its frame shrinking with each step, as if the hallway was swallowing it whole. I passed the first row of lockers. The numbers on them were wrong, sequences that didn't exist, repeating digits that looped like they were trying to form a message. 317, over and over every few doors. I touched one. The metal was cold enough to make my fingertips ache. When I pulled my hand away, a faint outline of a palm print appeared. Mark's or mine, I couldn't tell. Halfway down, I saw the first door. Room 214. I opened it, expecting another classroom. Inside was my old apartment, the one I lived in during my first year teaching. The kitchen table was covered in ungraded papers, my old coffee mug leaving rings on the wood. On the counter sat a note written in my own handwriting. Grade them tomorrow. I stepped back into the hallway. The door closed itself. The further I walked, the less sense the hallway made. Some lockers were tall, some were child-sized, and some were missing entirely, replaced by blank slabs of wall. Doors appeared at strange intervals, each one leading to a different fragment of my life. My father's hospital room, the gym where I once failed a mile run in high school, the grocery store aisle where I avoided making eye contact with a crying student years before I met Mark. It wasn't random. I knew it wasn't. This hallway was showing me every moment I had chosen not to stop, not to ask, not to get involved. The architecture of avoidance. Somewhere ahead, I heard footsteps. Slow, even. I followed them. The sound led me past a series of bulletin boards. They were all the same one, our classroom board, but with different messages. One said, Test Friday. Another, Parent-Teacher Conferences. And another, Do you see me yet? The hallway bent left without warning, the angle sharp enough to make me dizzy. When I turned the corner, I saw him. Mark was standing at the far end, facing away, his shoulders slightly hunched. He wasn't moving, but the footsteps continued, echoing without a source. I called his name. The sound went nowhere, swallowed before it reached him. I walked faster. The lockers on either side began to close in, the hallway narrowing. By the time I reached halfway, my shoulders brushed the metal on both sides. Mark turned his head slightly, not enough for me to see his face, but enough for me to know he'd heard me. Then he stepped around another corner. When I reached it, there was no one there, just more hallway. Endless. I don't know how long I walked. Time doesn't bend here, it stretches. Minutes become hours, or maybe hours become minutes. It's impossible to tell. Eventually, I saw a door marked Exit in the distance. I ran. My footsteps sounded too loud in the narrowing space, like they didn't belong to me anymore. When I reached it, the door wasn't metal. It was wood, carved with a single sentence. You can leave when you listen. I touched the handle. It turned, but when I pushed, the door opened back into the classroom. 3:17 a.m. again. The students sat as they always did. The empty desk was waiting. And on it, a note. 2 words, small and steady. Still walking. When I stepped back into the classroom, the air was wrong. It wasn't the still, heavy wrongness I had grown used to at 3:17 a.m. It was sharper, restless. The kind of atmosphere that makes you feel like you've walked into a conversation that was happening without you. The students were there, but something about them had changed. They no longer blurred at the edges. In fact, they seemed more defined than ever, too defined, as if the light was carving them into place. And yet, their faces were missing. Where features should have been, there was only darkness. Not a flat, empty blackness, but a depth, like each head was a window into a night sky with no stars. I froze. The empty desk was still empty, but even it seemed to lean toward me, as if waiting for me to take my place in whatever this was. I tried to speak. My voice caught on the first word, so I swallowed and tried again. Open your books. No one moved. Instead, one of the shadows in the front row tilted its head, slowly, deliberately, until it was almost horizontal. It held there for a moment before straightening again, as if testing the boundaries of its own form. I heard a sound then, a low, layered whisper. It wasn't coming from one place. It was coming from all of them, overlapping into a murmur too tangled to separate. I stepped closer to the nearest desk, straining to catch even a fragment. At first, it was nothing but a hiss, the shape of words without the clarity. Then slowly I began to make out phrases. The hand you didn't call on, the question you let die, the paper you marked instead of the person. The whispering grew louder, not in volume, but in weight. It pressed against my chest, making each breath feel like an act of defiance. I stepped back, and the voices dimmed, as if retreating with me. That's when the first one stood. The shadow was taller than the others, its edges flickering like the outline of a candle flame caught in a draft. It walked toward the chalkboard with slow, steady steps, picked up a piece of chalk, and began to write. Each letter appeared in white against the blackboard, but the chalk itself left no dust, no sound. You saw. You turned away. I shook my head instinctively as if denial could erase the words. I didn't know. The shadow turned to face me, though it had no face to turn. The absence where its eyes should have been seemed to pull at me, tugging me toward a center I didn't want to find. Another shadow rose from the back of the room and joined the first. Then another, and another. Within moments, they were all standing, 30 forms encircling me in a slow closing ring. They didn't touch me, but they didn't have to. The air between us was so charged I could feel the shape of their judgment. From somewhere near the empty desk, a voice, not a whisper this time, cut through. Show him. I turned. Mark was there. Not as a shadow, no, but not as he was in life either. His skin was pale, his edges blurred like a photograph left too long in the rain. His eyes held the same question they had in life. Will you see me this time? He raised his hand. My breath caught. It was the same gesture from months ago, the day he tried to speak, and I'd chosen to call on someone else. Except now, the scene didn't play from memory. It played here in real time. I could see myself at the front of the room looking straight at him and then looking away, calling on Thomas instead. The mark beside the empty desk lowered his hand and looked at me. The mark in the scene lowered his hand too. The two moments folded into each other until I couldn't tell which was past and which was punishment. The shadows began to speak again, but this time in unison, their voices layered into something almost physical. You saw. You turned away. I felt myself shrinking under the repetition. I wanted to shout, to explain, to beg for the scene to change, but my voice was gone, stolen by the rhythm of their verdict. Mark stepped closer to me until the space between us was no more than the length of a breath. His voice, when it came, was quiet, almost gentle. You think it's the moments you miss that keep you here, but it's the ones you saw and ignored. He placed something in my hand. It was small, smooth, and cold. I looked down. It was a piece of chalk. Write it, he said. I turned to the board. My hand trembled, but I began to write. I turned away. The moment the last letter was finished, the shadows stepped back. Not much, but enough for me to breathe again. Then they returned to their seats, each movement perfectly synchronized, the sound of chairs scraping against the floor echoing like a gavel strike. The classroom settled back into stillness. Only the empty desk seemed unchanged, waiting. When I turned to give the chalk back to Mark, he was gone. But on his desk, there was a note, folded twice. Inside, not done yet. The idea came to me in that half space between memory and this place. It wasn't really my thought. It was more like the hallway whispered it into me. Find the files. I'd walked past the front office 100 times in this purgatory version of the school, but I'd never gone in. The door was usually locked, the glass too clouded to see through. That night, though, the handle turned with no resistance, and the door swung open into a darkness that felt thicker than the rest of the building. The smell hit me first. Dust, paper, and something metallic underneath, like old staples that had begun to rust. Rows of filing cabinets stretched out in impossible directions, their labels worn down to smudges. Some drawers hung open just enough to suggest that someone had been there before me. I stepped inside. The door closed behind me without a sound. The cabinets weren't arranged alphabetically or by year or by any system I recognized. Their order felt personal, like the building had organized them according to its own logic, not mine. I started pulling drawers. Some were empty, some stuffed with papers so brittle they disintegrated when I touched them. Most held files that weren't even about students. Disciplinary notices for teachers I'd never met. Purchase orders for supplies the school never bought. Letters with no addressee. And then I found it. A drawer that stuck halfway, like it was resisting me. When I forced it open, there was a single folder inside. The label was handwritten, barely legible. Ellison, Mark. I carried it to the desk in the center of the office. The folder felt heavier than it should have, as if the paper inside had soaked up more than ink. I opened it carefully. At first glance, it was ordinary. Attendance records, report cards, notes from previous teachers. But the handwriting in the margins caught my eye. In the comments section of his second grade report card, a teacher had written, "Quiet, keeps to himself, needs encouragement to participate." In fifth grade, shows talent in creative writing, but often turns in incomplete work. Eighth grade, appears distracted, asked to meet after class, did not show. The pattern was obvious now, the same red flags year after year, the same cautious language. Nobody had written, "Something is wrong." Nobody had underlined it in red. We don't do that. We couch it in politeness, wrap it in professional detachment. Near the back of the folder was a sealed envelope. My name was written on it in faint pencil. I hesitated. The edges were already worn, as though it had been handled many times before finding its way here. I opened it slowly, careful not to tear the paper inside. It wasn't a letter, it was a draft of something. Sentences started and crossed out, rewritten, abandoned halfway. I could see where his pencil had pressed harder on certain words, where the lead had nearly broken. "Mr. Ethan, I don't know how to tell you. Some days I feel like I'm underwater. Maybe it's nothing, but it feels big to me." And then nothing. Just blank space, the kind that swallows you if you stare at it too long. The office around me seemed to grow colder. The lights above flickered. When I looked back down, the blank half of the page wasn't blank anymore. In thin, deliberate writings, the sentence was finished. "And I think you might be the only one who notices." My chest tightened. I had never seen those words before. Not in life, not until now. I gripped the paper too hard. And when I blinked, the ink was gone again, leaving only the unfinished thought. Something moved in the corner of the room. I turned, expecting a shadow, but it was Mark, standing just far enough away that the details of his face blurred. He didn't speak, he just nodded toward the folder, like telling me to keep going. I flipped through the remaining pages. Most were incident reports, not for fights or troublemaking, but for absences. Days where he hadn't shown up. Notes from the office calling home. One in particular stood out. Student returned after 3 days, said he was tired. Mother excused absence. Tired. It was the same word he'd whispered to me once. I'd assumed he meant the homework. I'd assumed wrong. The last page in the folder was not a school record. It was a photocopy of a photograph. Mark standing in front of the school during some kind of event, holding a certificate. He wasn't smiling exactly, but there was something in his eyes, a spark I'd never seen in class. On the back of the photo, in handwriting I recognized as Anna's, were the words, "He was proud of this." When I looked up, the office had changed. The rows of filing cabinets were gone. The desk was gone. I was standing in the hallway again, the folder still in my hands. I opened it once more. Empty. Every page, every note, gone. Only a single sheet remained. 3 words in the center, in pencil, "Not the end." I don't know if that was a promise or a warning. The first time I saw him, I thought it was a trick of the light. In this place, reflections have a habit of telling lies, and I've learned not to trust them. I had returned to the classroom as always, expecting the same stillness, the same arrangement, the 30 silent students, the empty desk, the faint ticking of the backward clock. But there was something different this time. I wasn't at the front of the room. Someone else was. He stood by the chalkboard, writing in a hand that was unmistakably mine. The same slow precision, the same slight slant to the right. But the words he wrote, I had never written them. I see you, I hear you, you matter here. I felt the sentence like a blow. The students, all of them, were looking at him, not with the vacant stillness they gave me, but with something alive in their eyes. They were leaning forward, their bodies angled toward him the way flowers turn to the sun. And Mark was there, not at the empty desk, but in the front row, his backpack slung over the back of his chair. He was watching the man at the board with quiet, unguarded focus. I stepped closer. The man didn't turn to look at me, but I could see his face now, messy, not as it is here, worn down, haunted, hollowed, but as it used to be, before the lines, before the permanent tension in my jaw. He looked like a version of me who still believed that teaching could save everyone. He turned back to the class. All right, he said, his voice warm, steady. Let's take 5 minutes. Mark, could you stay after? I want to talk to you about that essay idea you mentioned. I froze. That conversation never happened. Mark nodded. He didn't look nervous. He didn't glance toward the door like he was calculating how quickly he could leave. He stayed. The substitute, no, the other me, sat on the edge of a desk, leaning toward him. Tell me more about what you've been thinking, he said. Not for a grade, just so I can understand. Mark spoke then, his voice clear, steady. I couldn't hear the words. They were muffled, as though some invisible wall separated me from the sound. But I could see his hands moving, shaping the air as he talked. I could see the other me listening, not pretending to listen, but really listening. The kind of listening I wish I had done. I wanted to step forward, to get closer, to hear every word, but my feet wouldn't move. Something rooted me to the floor, forcing me to watch from a distance. After a moment, the other me reached into his desk and pulled out a sheet of paper. He slid it toward Mark. Here, he said, just write whatever you want. No rules, no grades. Bring it tomorrow or don't. I'll be here. Mark took the paper, and he smiled. Not a big smile, but enough that I felt the difference all the way across the room. Then the bell rang. Not the muted, warped sound of the 3:17 a.m. bell, but a clear, bright tone that cut through everything. The students began to gather their things. Mark left the paper in his bag, and for a moment the two of them just sat there, like there was no rush to leave. I blinked. When I opened my eyes, the room was empty, and the other me was gone. I went to the chalkboard. The words were still there. I see you, I hear you, you matter here. I picked up the eraser, but the words didn't fade. The chalk had sunk into the board itself, like it was part of its foundation now. On the empty desk, a single line was written in pencil. See what you could have done. I sank into my chair, the same seat from which I had ignored so much. The image of that conversation, Mark leaning forward, the other me nodding, wouldn't leave my head. I realized something then, something bitter and impossible. This place wasn't just a prison, it was a mirror, and sometimes it showed me the version of myself I had chosen not to be. The door to the classroom creaked. For a second, I thought the other me was coming back. But it wasn't him. It was Mark. He stood in the doorway holding the sheet of paper the other me had given him. He walked in slowly, placed it on my desk without looking at me, and turned to leave. I picked it up. The page was blank. But when I touched it, words began to bleed up from the fibers. You weren't him, but you could have been. It began as a faint vibration in the walls, a tremor so small I thought I was imagining it. But in this place, nothing comes without a reason. I was sitting at my desk, staring at the chalkboard where the other me's words still glowed faintly. I see you, I hear you, you matter here. No matter how many nights passed, they didn't fade. They sat there like a wound that wouldn't close. Then I heard it. A bell. Not the warped, dull chime I'd grown accustomed to at 3:17 a.m. This was sharp, bright. The kind of bell that in life signaled change. Class ending, class beginning, something moving forward. But here, Toyin, it didn't sound like permission. It sounded like a warning. The students turned toward the sound in unison, every head pivoting as if pulled by the same invisible thread. Even the shadows in their eyes seemed to still, listening. I stood. The bell rang again. It wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from everywhere. The empty desk was no longer empty. Mark was there. He sat perfectly still, hands folded on the desk, looking not at me but straight ahead at the chalkboard. His backpack was gone. There was no paper, no pencil, just him. I opened my mouth to speak, but the bell rang a third time, cutting through whatever I might have said. This was no ordinary signal. I could feel it in my chest, in my teeth. Each chime seemed to strip something away. Color from the walls, weight from the air, time from me. Mark, I managed to say. My voice sounded thin, almost transparent. Don't. The fourth chime came and something shifted. He began to fade. Not like the blurry edges I'd seen before, but truly fade. His outline breaking apart into fragments of light and shadow. I took a step toward him. Stay. He looked at me then finally. His gaze was steady, almost peaceful. And he said the first words I had heard from him clearly in this place. It's too late for this class. The fifth chime struck. The room around us trembled. The backward ticking clock on the wall cracked down the center, each half sliding apart like the split of a final decision. The chalkboard darkened until the other me's words were barely visible. I lunged forward, reaching for him, but the distance between us stretched impossibly. The more I moved, the farther away he seemed. The sixth chime came and his face began to dissolve, not in pain, not in fear, but in inevitability. Please, I said, I can do better. I can. The seventh chime cut me off. By now the students were gone. All of them. The desks sat empty, their absence louder than the bell itself. Only Mark remained, a faint echo of himself, a figure made of memory and regret. He didn't look angry. He didn't look sim. He simply looked finished. The eighth and final chime rang, and he was gone. The silence afterward was suffocating. The air felt thick as though the sound had pressed everything into stillness. I stood there staring at the empty desk, my own breath too loud in the void. I thought the bell might have ended something for me too, that maybe this was the release I had been waiting for. But the classroom didn't vanish. The clock still read 3:17 a.m. The door still led to the endless hallway. The only thing that had changed was that I knew, absolutely, that he would not come back. I sat in his chair. For the first time I felt how small it was, how the metal bit into the legs if you sat too long, how the desktop was never quite big enough for everything you had to carry. And I understood, in a way I never had before, that there are moments you don't get back. Not in life, not in purgatory, not even in dreams. The bell had told me the truth. There are no makeup classes here. I didn't sleep that night. Not that sleep means anything here. Time is a shape in this place, not a flow. But I still felt the weight of hours pressing down, each one whispering the same truth. He wouldn't be back. When I entered the classroom again, I expected the same empty stage, 30 silent desks, the chalkboard still darkened from the last verdict, the empty desk at the window like a tooth pulled from the drawer of the room. But something was different. There was a stack of papers on my desk. It took me a moment to realize they weren't mine. The handwriting wasn't mine either. Too rounded, too patient. Each page had a title written neatly at the top. Lesson plan. I flipped through them. No dates, no subject headers, just lists of single words, each written in capital letters, as if they were the only topics that mattered. empathy, attention, listening, belief time. The last page held only one word, underlined twice: love. I ran my fingers over the ink. It wasn't just dry, it felt warm, as though the words had been written moments before I arrived. There was no name anywhere, but I didn't need one. This was his, Mark's. Or maybe it was from the other me, the one who had stayed after class, who had asked the questions I never did. In this place, their handwriting was the same. The room felt different, too. The air didn't press against me the way it usually did. The shadows under the desks were softer, less like traps and more like places to rest. I set the stack down and looked at the chalkboard. The dark smudge from the last trial had been wiped clean. In the corner, faint as breath on glass, was a question. What will you teach now? I stood there for a long time. Because I didn't know, I'd spent my career teaching things that could be graded, measured, evaluated. I knew how to teach formulas, essay structures, historical timelines. I didn't know how to teach the words on that list, not in a way that would count for points, but maybe points were the problem. I picked up a piece of chalk. It felt heavier than usual, as though it had absorbed the weight of the question. Slowly, I wrote on the board, today's lesson, being present. The words looked almost strange up there, like they didn't belong in a classroom. But they stayed. I turned to the students. Yes, they were all here again. Even though I knew they weren't here in the way the living are, it didn't matter. They were my audience, my responsibility, my reminder. Being present, I began, isn't about where your body is. It's about where your attention lives. No one moved, but I felt them listening. The silence wasn't empty this time. It was an open space ready to be filled. It's easy to think you're paying attention because you're looking at someone. But attention isn't just sight. It's the decision to let someone else's reality take priority over your own for a moment. I paused, unsure if I was talking to them or to myself. Maybe both. From the corner of my eye, I saw a movement at the empty desk. Not Mark, just a flicker, like the air itself was leaning forward. Most of the time, I continued, we think people will tell us what's wrong if it's important. But some things are too heavy to name out loud. Sometimes the only way to hear them is to listen for what isn't being said. I wrote the word listening under the lesson title, just as it had appeared on his page. Then something happened that hadn't happened in all my nights here. One of the students raised a hand. It was a girl in the back row. Her form is still blurred at the edges, but solid enough that I could see her fingers trembling slightly. I nodded to her. She didn't speak right away, but when she did, her voice was clear. Why are you telling us this now? I had no answer ready, but I gave her the truth. Because I should have told you sooner. She lowered her hands slowly and the stillness returned. But it was a different stillness than before. Not oppressive, not cold. It felt like the pause in a conversation that isn't over yet. When the period ended, if you could call it that, no bell rang. The students simply faded one by one, leaving the room empty except for the stack of lesson plans and me. I picked them up again. On the back of the last page, written in faint pencil, was a new line that hadn't been there before. Keep going, they're still here. I didn't know if they meant the students or the people I had failed, or some part of myself I thought I'd lost. Maybe all of them. I slid the pages into my desk drawer and closed it gently, as if they could break. For the first time since I arrived in this place, I didn't dread the next lesson. For the first time, I felt like I had something worth teaching. It appeared on my desk without warning. No rustle of paper, no hand to place it there. Just a single sheet, perfectly centered, as though the air itself had been holding it for me until the right moment. At first glance, it looked like a test. My name was at the top, but written in neat block letters. Ethan. Below it, in the same familiar handwriting that had filled so many of my attendance sheets and report comments, was a column of numbers, each circled in red. The numbers didn't make sense at first. They weren't points or percentages. They were dates. Every one of them was a day I remembered, though I wished I didn't. 10:14, didn't ask why he was late. 11:02. Didn't follow up after group work. 12:05. Called on Thomas instead. 12:12. Handed back the 62. The list went on, each date another cut into the timeline, another moment when I'd chosen efficiency over attention, protocol over compassion. Halfway down the page, the red ink shifted. The notes became less specific, less about single acts, more about the absence of them. Didn't see, didn't listen, didn't stay. I flipped the page over. There were no questions, no prompts, no essay sections. Just one final line, written dead center in bold, deliberate strokes. Final grade. The space after the colon was empty. I stared at it, waiting for the number or letter to appear on its own, the way the notes and chalkboard messages always had. But nothing came. The blank space felt heavier than any score could have. That's when I realized I was meant to fill it in myself. The room around me shifted. The students were back, but not seated. They stood along the walls, forming a loose circle around the desks, their faces shadowed as always. The empty desk was gone. In its place stood Mark. He held a red pen. He didn't say a word as he walked toward me. The pen tapped lightly against his palm, an almost rhythmic sound, steady enough to feel like a countdown. He stopped at the edge of my desk and looked down at the paper. I wanted to tell him I wasn't ready, that there were still lessons left, still something I could do to change the outcome. But the truth hung in the space between us. I had already taught everything I was ever going to teach him. The grading period was over. Mark set the pen on the desk and stepped back. The weight of choice slid toward me like a slow avalanche. I picked up the pen. My hand hovered over the blank space. What was I supposed to write? A failing grade? I had failed him, yes, but would admitting it here change anything? A passing grade? That felt like a lie so loud it would echo in every corner of this place. The students shifted slightly, their movements soft but synchronized. The air was waiting. I thought about the list in the lesson plan: empathy, attention, listening, belief, time, love. I thought about how I had taught none of those to him, not when it mattered, and yet I had learned them here, in the worst way possible, but I had learned them. I pressed the pen to the paper. My hands shook, not from fear of being wrong, but from knowing there was no right answer. Slowly I wrote, incomplete. The word looked fragile against the stark whiteness of the page. But it was true, I hadn't finished. Maybe I never could. I set the pen down. When I looked up, Mark was watching me, not with accusation, but with something almost like understanding. He stepped forward, took the paper, and studied it for a moment. Then he turned it back toward me. The word I had written was still there, but faintly beneath it, in his handwriting, was another word: continue. The clock on the wall ticked forward for the first time in what felt like years. 3:17 became 3:18. The smallest change in the world, but in this place, it felt like the floor is shifting under my feet. Mark placed the paper back on my desk, nodded once, and walked toward the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. Without turning back, he said, "Class isn't over yet." Then he stepped into the hallway and was gone. The silence that followed wasn't the old silence, the suffocating, sealed kind. It was open now, like the space between notes and music, the kind that leaves room for what comes next. And for the first time since I arrived here, I realized I wanted to find out what that was. I'd passed it more times than I could count. At the end of the endless hallway, tucked between two rows of lockers that never changed, stood the door that never opened. It wasn't grand, no ornate frame, no stained glass, just wood, old but solid, with a tarnished brass handle that refused to turn. The kind of door you might walk past every day without thinking about, unless you'd been told you couldn't go through it. And I had been told, not in words, but in the way it had always resisted me. I'd rattled the handle in my earliest nights here, desperate for an exit. I'd knocked once, twice, more than I care to admit, half expecting someone to open it from the other side. No one ever did. So eventually I stopped trying. Until tonight. The hallway was quiet when I left the classroom. No shuffling footsteps, no echo of lockers clicking shut on their own. Just stillness. stretching ahead like an invitation I didn't trust. And there it was, the door. Only one. It wasn't shut. The latch was loose. The handle rested just a little too far down, as if someone had been holding it a moment before and let go. A sliver of space ran along the edge where wood met frame, and through it I could see light. Not the cold fluorescence of the school, but something warmer, like late afternoon sun spilling across a floor. I stopped a few feet away. My hands didn't move. My body remembered the years of refusal, the weight of knowing what wasn't allowed. A thought rose, uninvited. If you open it, you might not come back. Another followed. If you don't, you might never leave. Behind me, the hallway stretched into forever, each locker a sentinel of all the moments I'd avoided, all the things I hadn't done. Ahead of me, the door waited. I reached for the handle. My hand stopped midair, because suddenly I wasn't alone. Mark stood beside the lockers to my left, not blocking me, not urging me forward, just there. He looked the way he had in his better moments, when his shoulders weren't hunched forward, when his gaze wasn't fixed on some invisible point in the distance. He was calm, watching. "Is this it?" I asked. My voice was quieter than I meant. "Is this the way out?" Mark didn't answer. Instead, he glanced toward the door, then back to me, his expression unreadable. It wasn't the silence of refusal. It was the silence of leaving the choice entirely in my hands. I thought about the lesson plan, about the incomplete I had given myself, about the word he'd written beneath it, continue. Leaving might mean ending, and I wasn't sure my work here, whatever work meant in a place like this, was done. I let my hand drop. Mark tilted his head just enough to make me feel the question in it. "Why no?" "Because I don't think I've earned it yet," I said. For the first time he smiled. Not the full smile of the other version of him I'd seen with the substitute, but something smaller, sharper, like the edge of a new understanding. He stepped closer, close enough that the light from the door spilled across both of us. And in that glow, I realized something strange. It wasn't just warmth coming through. It was sound, faint but real. Footsteps, conversation, the murmur of life, the world beyond. I took a deep breath. "When it's time," I told him, "I'll walk through, but not until I've taught everything I should have taught you before." Mark studied me for a long moment, then nodded once. The light from the door dimmed, the sound faded, and slowly, without either of us touching it, the door swung shut. The latch clicked, locked again. I didn't feel trapped this time. I turned back toward the hallway. It stretched out, infinite as ever, but for the first time I wasn't afraid of its length. I had work to do. It happened without a bell. No chime, no sharp break in the air, just a shift, subtle but undeniable. Like the moment the tide changes and you realize the waves have been pulling you in a new direction all along. That morning, if you could call any hour here morning, I walked into the classroom with the same slow certainty as always. The desks were full again, every face still shadowed, yet watching. The empty desk was there too, but I no longer feared it. It had become less of a wound and more of a reminder. The chalkboard was blank. No warnings, no verdicts, just an open space waiting to be filled. On my desk sat the stack of lesson plan pages Mark had left me. I flipped to the last one. Love, underlined twice. Beneath it, faint as breath, a final edition had appeared overnight. Say it before they go. I looked up at the class. The air felt expectant, like they knew something was ending, though none of us could say what. I began without thinking. We spend so much time believing that life is a series of grades, that we're here to be evaluated, ranked, measured. But I've learned something here. Too late for one student, maybe not too late for the rest of you. I let my gaze sweep over them. The real tests don't come on paper. They come when someone you care about is silent, and you have to decide whether to ask why. They come when you notice something's wrong, and you have to choose whether to step closer or turn away. A flicker of movement drew my eyes to the back row. A boy had raised his hand. I nodded to him. "Is this the last class?" he asked. The question hit harder than I expected. My first instinct was to say yes, to let the weight of finality close this chapter cleanly, but honesty had been the one thing missing from too many of my lessons. "I don't know," I said. "Maybe for me, maybe for you. But even if you leave this room, the lessons don't end. They follow you." I wrote the word continue on the board, big enough that it filled the space. The classroom felt warmer now, not in temperature, but in presence. The silence between us wasn't heavy, it was alive, charged with something I couldn't name. I glanced toward the empty desk, and he was there. Mark. Not fading, not distant, solid. No shadows at the edges. He looked exactly as he had the day I first met him, except for one detail. He was looking directly at me. I didn't speak at first, neither did he. We just held each other's gaze, the kind of look that feels like a bridge between two places that were never meant to meet again. Then quietly I said, "I'm sorry I didn't see you sooner." He nodded once. "You see me now." It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly. It was something quieter, more precise, an acknowledgement, and somehow it was enough. He stood, pushed his chair in, and walked to the door. But before leaving, he turned back. "Class dismissed," he said. The words settled into the room like dust, soft and final. The other students began to fade, one by one, until I was alone. The clock on the wall ticked forward. 3:18, 3:19, 3:20. I had never seen it move this far before. The hallway outside was waiting. I stepped into it, half expecting the lockers to stretch into infinity again. But they didn't. The end was visible now, and the locked door was gone. In its place was open air, sunlight spilling through like it had been there all along. I took a step forward, then stopped. Turning back, I looked into the classroom one last time. The empty desk was still there, but it didn't hurt to see it. I smiled, small but real, and whispered, "Thank you for staying until I learned." Then I walked toward the light. Thanks for watching the whole video. Please give me a like and subscribe to the channel to watch more interesting stories.